The next vote to advance a government funding bill is set for today. The president met with some Senate Republicans yesterday and said the GOP, quote, will not be extorted into giving Democrats what they want. Democratic leaders say they've reached out to the president to negotiate on their health care demands, but the president said no meeting will happen until the government reopens.
You normally feel pressure by now. Normally you wait until a payday,
right?
Okay, and the troops not getting paid, nobody can stay. It also is normally in these fights, everybody starts euphoria. You know, both sides are, we're winning because the base tells you that. And then you get 2 weeks into it, it's usually pretty defined. But the country's very divided. So Republicans think it's Democrats' fault, Democrats think it's Republicans' fault.
Well, I don't think either side is looking at this as what do they gain from it. You know, what they want is what they want, right? You know, Republicans obviously want Democrats to sign on to this temporary short-term funding bill, even though we're starting to bump up against the deadline. It would just fund the government, excuse me, for the next, couple of weeks. But still, Republicans say they need Democratic votes for that. And then, of course, you have Democrats who say we have to address this issue of health care. These premiums under the Affordable Care Act are going to skyrocket at the end of the year. Republicans so far haven't negotiated with us on that.
Okay, so let me ask you something. What do you think happens when a president decides that entire government agencies are, quote, Democrat agencies and uses a government shutdown to fire thousands of people who've worked there for decades? What happens when the leader of the free world openly admits he's using a budget crisis to purge career civil servants because he thinks they're politically disloyal? I'll tell you what happens. The American middle class gets destroyed. That's what happens. And it's happening right now in real time while most people aren't even paying attention. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Congress congressionally approves, and obviously dealing with this issue of health care, rolling back some of those Medicaid cuts in the big, beautiful bill. So it's the overall actions of the administration that are causing Democrats here to hold the line, which is why they're not budging. Republicans, though, not budging either. As you heard the president tell Democrats yesterday, he's not sitting down with them until they reopen the government.
This is the story that should be dominating every news channel, every front page, every conversation in America. Between October 1st and October 15th, 2025, the Trump administration fired over 4,200 federal workers. These aren't political appointees. These aren't people who serve at the pleasure of the president. These are career civil servants, people who've worked for the government for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, people who process your Social Security checks, who inspect your food, who manage disaster relief, who do the unglamorous but essential work that keeps this country functioning. And Trump just fired them, thousands of them, because he's decided their agencies are too Democrat, too disloyal, too much part of what he calls the deep state. And here's the worst part, he's not even hiding it. On October 14th, during a press briefing, Trump said, and I'm quoting directly here, the shutdown allowed him to, quote, close up Democrat programs we never wanted and will never bring back. Let that sink in for a second. The president of the United States is openly admitting that he's using a government shutdown, a crisis that's hurting millions of Americans, as an opportunity to permanently eliminate programs and fire thousands of workers because he's labeled them as Democrats. This isn't about efficiency. This isn't about cutting waste. This is a political purge. This is Trump using the full power of the executive branch to reshape the federal government into something that only serves his vision, his allies, his agenda. Can you believe this? We're watching the systematic dismantling of the American middle class happening in real time, because here's what people need to understand about federal workers. For generations, working for the government has been one of the most reliable paths to the middle class, especially for Black Americans and other minorities who face discrimination in the private sector. Federal jobs offer stability, decent pay, good benefits, and protection from arbitrary firing. You couldn't just get fired because your boss didn't like you, or because of your race, or because of your politics. There were rules, there were protections, there was due process, and that meant families could build wealth, buy homes, send their kids to college, create generational stability. But Trump is destroying all of that. He's turning federal employment into something where you can be fired at any moment if the administration decides your agency is too Democrat, or if you're not loyal enough to the president personally. Let's talk numbers for a second, because the scale of this is staggering. Over 4,200 workers fired in just 2 weeks from the Treasury Department, Health and Human Services, Education, Interior, agencies across the entire federal government. And this is just the beginning. OMB Director Russell Vought, who's leading this purge, has made it clear that they're planning to go much further. He's defending this as, quote, restoring accountability and eliminating deep state interference from agencies loyal to Democrats. Think about that language. Agencies loyal to Democrats. As if career civil servants who were hired under both Republican and Democratic administrations are somehow secretly working for the Democratic Party just because they happen to work at an agency Trump doesn't like. It's insane. It's authoritarian. And it's happening right here in America in 2025. Senator Angela Also Brooks from Maryland, where a huge number of federal workers live, said something really important about this. She said, and I'm quoting, "It's eroding generational wealth for entire families," because that's exactly what's happening. When you fire thousands of middle-class federal workers, you're not just hurting those individuals, you're hurting their families, their communities, entire regional economies that depend on the stability of federal employment. Around Washington, D.C., in Maryland, in Virginia, there are entire neighborhoods, entire towns where the economy is built on federal workers, black middle-class communities that have existed for generations because federal employment offered a path to stability that the private sector often denied. And now Trump is destroying that. He's taken away the economic foundation that allowed these communities to exist. And for what? To score political points, to purge people he's decided are disloyal, to implement his vision of what government should look like. And here's where it gets even worse. A federal judge had to step in on October 15th and issue a temporary restraining order to stop the firings, because federal unions sued, arguing that Trump is violating federal employment laws and engaging in illegal political discrimination. A judge looked at what Trump was doing and said, "Hold on. This is so clearly illegal that I'm going to order you to stop immediately while we sort this out in court." But Trump and his administration, they're showing no signs of backing down. They're fighting the order. They're arguing that the president has the authority to do this. They're trying to fundamentally rewrite the rules about how the federal government works and who gets protected from arbitrary political purges. This is not normal. This is not how democracy is supposed to function. You don't get to fire thousands of career civil servants because you've decided their agency is politically disloyal. You don't get to use a government shutdown as an excuse to permanently eliminate programs and jobs you don't like. You don't get to destroy the middle class because it's politically convenient. But that's exactly what Trump is doing. And if he gets away with this, if the courts don't stop him, if Congress doesn't intervene, if the American people don't demand accountability, then we're looking at a fundamental transformation of how government works in this country. We're looking at the end of nonpartisan civil service. We're looking at a system where every government employee serves at the pleasure of whoever's in power and can be fired the moment they're deemed insufficiently loyal. That's not democracy. That's something else entirely. All right, let's dig into what's really happening here and why this is so dangerous. So here's what most people are missing about this story. This isn't just Trump being Trump. This isn't just another example of him saying something outrageous or doing something controversial. This is the systematic implementation of a long-term conservative plan to completely reshape the federal government. And it's working. Because while everyone's focused on the government shutdown, while everyone's arguing about spending bills and budget priorities, Trump is using the chaos as cover to fundamentally transform who gets to work in government and how much power career civil servants have. Let me explain what's really going on here. First, we need to talk about Schedule F. This is a policy Trump tried to implement at the end of his first term, but didn't have time to fully execute before Biden took office and reversed it. The basic idea of Schedule F was to reclassify tens of thousands of federal workers from protected civil service positions into at-will employees who could be fired at any time for any reason. Trump and his allies argued this was necessary to give the president more control over the bureaucracy, to make it easier to fire people who weren't implementing his agenda effectively. But what it really is a way to turn the entire federal government into a political operation where everyone serves at the pleasure of the president. No more protections, no more due process, no more nonpartisan civil service, just political loyalty as the only thing that matters. And now, in his second term, Trump is implementing Schedule F through the back door. He's using the government shutdown as an excuse to do mass layoffs, what they're calling reductions in force or RFs. And he's specifically targeting agencies and departments he's labeled as Democrat agencies. Think about how crazy that is. The Department of Education, Democrat agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, Democrat agency, Health and Human Services, Democrat agency, as if these federal departments that have existed for decades, that serve all Americans, regardless of politics, somehow belong to one political party. But that's how Trump sees government. Everything is either loyal to him or it's the enemy. There's no middle ground. There's no such thing as nonpartisan public service. You're either with him or you're against him. And here's the thing that should terrify everyone. This isn't just about Trump. This is about a broader conservative movement that's been working toward this goal for years. Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's massive policy blueprint for the next Republican administration, explicitly calls for politicizing the federal workforce. It calls for making it easier to fire career civil servants. It calls for replacing them with political appointees who are loyal to the conservative movement. Trump is just a vehicle for implementing these ideas. He's just a guy willing to be openly authoritarian about it. But the agenda? That's been brewing in conservative think tanks for decades. They want to dismantle what they call the administrative state. They want to eliminate the idea that government agencies can operate independently based on expertise and law rather than political preference. They want every part of government to be directly controlled by whoever's in charge. Now, let's talk about who's actually being hurt by this. Because the media keeps framing this as a bureaucratic story, as a Washington story, as something that only matters to policy wonks and political insiders. But that's completely wrong. The people being fired aren't faceless bureaucrats. They're middle-class Americans. They're people who worked their way up from entry-level positions, who studied hard, who passed civil service exams, who dedicated their careers to public service. And a huge number of them are Black Americans and other minorities, because historically the federal government has been one of the best employers for people of color. When private companies were discriminating, when corporate America had glass ceilings and closed doors, the federal government offered a path forward. It wasn't perfect. There was still discrimination, but the protections were stronger. The opportunities were more real. And over time, federal employment became a cornerstone of the Black middle class. There are entire communities around Washington, D.C., in Prince George's County, Maryland, in Northern Virginia, where generations of Black families built wealth through federal employment. Your grandmother worked at the Department of Agriculture. Your father worked at the VA. You work at HHS. And you're planning for your kids to go to college and maybe get good jobs, maybe even start their own businesses because you have that foundation of stable middle-class income. That's the American dream, right? Work hard, play by the rules, build something for your family. But Trump is destroying that. He's firing people who've worked in government for 20 or 30 years, people who thought they had job security, people who made career decisions based on the promise that civil service meant protection from arbitrary political firing, and now they're gone, just like that, because Trump decided their agency was too Democrat. Senator Also Brooks from Maryland has been sounding the alarm on this, and she's exactly right when she talks about generational wealth, because when you fire a federal worker who's been making $60 or $70 or $80,000 a year, you're not just taking away their current income, you're taking away their pension, you're taking away their health insurance, you're taking away their ability to help their kids with college, you're taking away the economic stability that allowed them to be homeowners, to be investors, to be part of the middle class, and in many cases, you're taking away the only good job in their family. The one person who made it, who climbed into the professional class, who was supposed to be the foundation for the next generation to do even better. That's what Trump is destroying. That's what this purge is really about. It's not about efficiency or accountability. It's about dismantling the pathways that allow working class people, especially people of color, to reach the middle class. And let's talk about the legal situation, because this is where things get really interesting. On October 15th, a federal judge issued a temporary restraining order halting the firings after federal unions sued. The unions are arguing that Trump is violating federal employment law, that you can't just mass fire people for political reasons, that there are procedures and protections that have to be followed, and the judge agreed that there's enough evidence of illegality to stop the firings while the case proceeds, but Trump's administration is fighting back hard. OMB Director Russell Vought is arguing that the president has broad authority to reorganize the executive branch, to eliminate positions, to reduce the workforce as he sees fit. They're essentially arguing that the president is above these employment laws, that he can do whatever he wants with the federal workforce because he's the chief executive. This is a critical legal battle, because if Trump wins, if the courts say that the president can mass fire career civil servants for political reasons during a shutdown, then we've fundamentally changed how government works. Every future president will have that power. Every administration will be able to purge the workforce and replace career professionals with political loyalists. And that means the end of expertise in government, the end of institutional knowledge, the end of any kind of independence or professionalism in how federal agencies operate. Everything becomes political. Everything becomes about loyalty to whoever's in power. That's not a better government. That's not a more efficient government. That's a government that can't function effectively because it's constantly being torn apart and rebuilt based on whoever won the last election. But here's what really gets me about this whole situation. Trump is doing this in the open. He's not trying to hide it. He's not using coded language or pretending this is about anything other than politics. He's openly saying he's closing Democrat programs. He's openly saying he's firing people from Democrat agencies. He's making it crystal clear that this is a political purge designed to reshape government into something that serves his vision and his party. And yet, a huge chunk of the country either doesn't know this is happening or doesn't care, because we're so numb to Trump doing outrageous things that even something this extreme, even something this fundamentally authoritarian, gets treated as just another day in Trump world. And that's the real danger here. not just what Trump is doing, but the fact that we've normalized it. The fact that a president can openly admit to a political purge of the federal workforce, and it doesn't immediately trigger a constitutional crisis. It doesn't immediately lead to impeachment hearings. It doesn't immediately unite the country in opposition to such a blatant abuse of power. Instead, it's just another story in the news cycle. Just another controversy that'll get argued about on cable news for a few days before everyone moves on to the next thing. But this isn't just another thing. This is one of the most significant attacks on American democracy and the middle class that we've seen in modern history. And if we don't treat it that way, if we don't demand accountability, if we don't fight back against this, then it's going to get worse, much worse. All right, let's talk about what this means going forward and what comes next. So let's break down what all of this actually means for the country going forward. Because this isn't just about federal workers. This isn't just about the government shutdown. This is about the future of the American middle class and whether we're going to have any kind of nonpartisan professional government anymore. First, the obvious economic impact. When you fire over 4,200 middle-class workers in 2 weeks, you're creating immediate economic devastation in the communities where those workers live. We're talking about people who suddenly can't pay their mortgages, people who have to pull their kids out of private schools or cancel college plans, people who were planning to retire in a few years, but now have to figure out how to survive without the pension they thought was guaranteed. This creates a ripple effect throughout local economies. These federal workers aren't just earning salaries, they're spending money at local businesses. They're paying property taxes that fund schools and services. They're the customers that keep restaurants and shops and service providers in business. Around Washington, D.C., in Maryland, and Virginia, there are entire regional economies built on federal employment. When you suddenly remove thousands of federal workers from that economy, businesses suffer. Tax revenues decline. Property values drop. It's not just the fired workers who get hurt. It's everyone around them. And the communities that get hit hardest are the black middle-class neighborhoods that relied on federal employment as their pathway to stability. Prince George's County in Maryland, for example, has the highest concentration of affluent black families in America, and a huge part of that wealth was built on federal employment. Now Trump is systematically destroying that foundation. He's taken away the economic stability that allowed those communities to exist and thrive. This is generational damage that'll take decades to recover from, if it ever does. Second, let's talk about what this means for government services. When you fire thousands of experienced civil servants, the government can't function as well. These aren't random people doing make-work jobs. These are experts who know how their agencies operate, who understand complex regulations and programs, who have institutional knowledge that you can't just replace overnight. When you fire a 20-year veteran of the Department of Education who understands student loan programs inside and out, you lose that expertise. When you fire experienced inspectors from the Food and Drug Administration, food safety suffers. When you fire career employees from the Treasury Department who understand tax law and financial regulations, enforcement becomes less effective. Trump and his allies will claim that government is bloated and inefficient, that cutting workers will make things better, but that's nonsense. What's actually going to happen is that services will decline, processing times will get longer, mistakes will increase, and ordinary Americans will pay the price. Third, this is fundamentally reshaping the relationship between citizens and their government. For over a century, we've had a professional civil service system where government employees are supposed to serve the public interests, not political interests. The idea was that when you go to the Social Security office or you call the IRS or you interact with any federal agency, the people helping you are professionals who follow the law and serve all Americans equally regardless of who's in power. But Trump is destroying that model. He's turning federal employment into a political patronage system where your job depends on your loyalty to whoever's president. And what does that mean for citizens? It means that how you're treated by the government might depend on your politics. It means that agencies might prioritize helping people who supported the administration and ignore or mistreat people who didn't. It means the end of equal treatment under law. That's not speculation. That's the logical endpoint of politicizing the entire federal workforce. Fourth, and this is critical, Trump is testing the limits of executive power. He's seeing how far he can push, how much he can get away with, whether the courts and Congress will actually stop him or just issue strongly worded statements while he does whatever he wants. And so far, he's learning that he can push pretty far. Yes, there's a temporary restraining order. Yes, there are lawsuits, but he's still in office. He's still claiming he has the authority to do this. His supporters are still defending him, and he's betting that by the time the legal process plays out, he'll have accomplished what he wanted to accomplish. He'll have fired thousands of workers. He'll have reshaped agencies. He'll have sent the message that if you work in government, you better be loyal to him personally or you're gone. That's how authoritarians work. They push boundaries. They ignore norms. They dare the system to stop them. And often, the system doesn't act fast enough or decisively enough to make a difference. Fifth, the 2026 midterms are going to be hugely important because if Republicans maintain control of Congress, Trump will interpret that as validation. He'll go even further with the purges. He'll implement Schedule F fully. He'll replace tens of thousands more career civil servants with political appointees. But if Democrats win back the House or expand their Senate majority, they can investigate, they can hold hearings, they can use the power of the purse to stop some of this, they can protect federal workers through legislation, they can demand accountability. The midterms are essentially a referendum on whether Americans approve of what Trump is doing to the federal government, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Sixth, we need to talk about the racial dimension of this, because while Trump and his allies won't say it explicitly, the fact is that mass firings of federal workers disproportionately hurt Black Americans and other minorities. The federal government has been one of the most important employers for people of color in American history. It's been a pathway to the middle class when other doors were closed, and now that pathway is being destroyed. This is environmental racism in a sense. It's economic warfare against communities that have relied on federal employment, and it's happening at the same time as all the other Trump policies that hurt minority communities, the criminal justice policies, the immigration crackdowns, the cuts to social programs. This is part of a broader pattern of using government power to harm communities that didn't support Trump politically. Seventh, public sector unions are going to be in the fight of their lives. Federal employee unions like AFGE, the American Federation of Government Employees, are on the front lines defending workers' rights. They're the ones filing lawsuits. They're the ones organizing resistance. They're the ones trying to protect their members from arbitrary political firing. But unions have been weakened over decades. Their membership is down, their resources are limited, and they're up against an administration that's openly hostile to organized labor and that has the full power of the federal government behind it. This is a David versus Goliath battle. And while the unions are fighting hard, it's not clear they can win without broader public support and congressional action. 8. And finally, this is about the future of American democracy. Because once you destroy the nonpartisan civil service, once you turn every government job into a political position, you fundamentally change how democracy works. You've created a system where government serves whoever's in power rather than serving the public interest. You've eliminated the checks and balances that come from having professional civil servants who follow the law regardless of politics. You've opened the door to massive corruption because there's nobody left to blow the whistle, nobody left to say no when the president wants to do something illegal or unethical. This is how democracies die, not with tanks in the streets, not with a sudden coup, but with gradual erosion of institutions, with steady consolidation of power, with the elimination of anyone who might provide independent judgment or resistance. So what happens next? The courts are going to rule on whether Trump's mass firings are legal. If they rule against him, he'll probably appeal all the way to the Supreme Court. And who knows how the conservative majority will rule. They might side with Trump and say the president has broad authority to reshape the executive branch. Or they might rule more narrowly and say he violated specific employment laws. Either way, this legal battle is going to define executive power for generations. In the meantime, thousands of federal workers are in limbo. Some have been fired and are fighting to get their jobs back. Some are still employed, but terrified they're next. Some are looking for private sector jobs because they don't trust that their federal position is secure anymore. And communities across the country are suffering as the economic impact spreads. This is the state of America in 2025. A president openly conducting political purges of the federal workforce. A middle class being systematically dismantled. Communities that relied on stable government employment watching their foundation crumble. And most people either don't know it's happening or have been convinced that it's somehow necessary, somehow justified, somehow not as bad as it actually is. But it is bad. It's really bad. And if we don't stop this now, if we don't demand accountability and fight back against these authoritarian moves, then we're going to wake up one day in a country where democracy is just a word we use, but not something that actually exists anymore. Stay tuned because this fight is just beginning, and what happens next is going to determine what kind of country we live in for decades to come.